Hello National 5 pupils. This lesson is looking at what Scotland was like in 1910. So this is before World War One starts. So this is a bit of background to our topic and to the war. So what we're aiming to do is to describe what it was like to live and work in Scotland in 1910 and describe the problems people face living in Glasgow in particular. And we'll look to explain issues with the Scottish economy. Now our success criteria, what we're aiming to do by the end of this lesson is you will be able to describe the social, political and economic situation in Scotland in the 1900s, so what was life like in Scotland effectively, and explain what it was like to be in Scotland in 1900. Now, a wee overview for you here. In 1910, Britain was the world's greatest superpower. Now, the reason for that is it ruled an empire which covered around a quarter of the world's surface, and ultimately Scotland played a very, very important role in this. Glasgow in particular was called the second city of the empire because of its success and wealth from heavy industries like shipbuilding and steelmaking. And despite appearances, however, there were problems. Glasgow, Scotland and Britain had been facing a lot of challenges that would lead to trouble in the future. So although Britain is the world's greatest superpower, and on the face of it things seem to be really good, there is a lot of issues facing Glasgow, facing Scotland and facing Britain as a whole, which we will be looking at. Now, the British Empire. When George V came to the throne in 1910, he became King of Britain, one of the world's greatest superpowers, and also the Emperor of India, because India was part of the British Empire at this time. His government ruled an empire that covered around 25% of the world. Now, British Empire task, this is just your first task to start off with. Now, you could leave Glasgow on a British ship in 1910 and travel the world without actually having to step into a non-British country because Britain rules so many countries in the world. There was a phrase that people used to say, the sun used to never set on the British Empire, showing that effectively Britain ruled a lot of countries at this time. Now, in your jotters, what we'd like you to do to start with is to try and write down at least 4 countries that were part of the British Empire in 1910. Now, to start you off, an example is Australia. You have another country which we've just mentioned that was in the British Empire. Try to find out the names of other countries that were in the British Empire in 1910. So if you want to pause the PowerPoint here and you can complete this task. Okay, now why was Glasgow called the Empire's second city? Glasgow had a huge population. It had over 1 million people at this time, and it was the largest city in Scotland. It used wealth from the Empire to build things like the city chambers, which are still obviously in existence, and while Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen all contributed to the wealth of Britain, at the time Glasgow was kind of special. In particular because it had the shipbuilding industry and old involvement in the slave trade. It made Glasgow a very popular city. It produced a lot of jobs for people in Glasgow as well. Now, this is just some of the buildings in Glasgow that were produced through the profits of being involved in the Empire. You may recognise some of these buildings. Now, industries that are developed in Scotland at this time. Scotland's main industries at this time were coal mining, iron and steel making, engineering, shipbuilding, the jute industry, in particular in Dundee, fishing in Aberdeen, and because Glasgow was the most industrial area, reason for that is due to shipbuilding, because a fifth of the world's ships were made there, and raw materials used to make the ships were mined nearby. So Glasgow, with having coal mining in the surrounding area very nearby and having shipbuilding, made Glasgow a very industrial area, producing a lot of jobs. The fact that Glasgow was making a fifth of the world's ships at this time shows you how popular shipbuilding was. Now, coal mining. There were many coal mines to give the industries their power source. So before 1914 there were 560 coal mines in central Scotland alone. Glasgow was also important because of its location. If you think about the Clyde in Glasgow, that meant that transport was easy and cheap, and there was a direct trade route for the rest of the empire to Scotland and from Scotland to the rest of the world. Because of this, lots of new industries like engineering companies and businesses set up in Glasgow, and that created jobs for hundreds of thousands of Scots there. And in the pre-war period, Glasgow and the west of Scotland seemed to have a secure industrial outlook. So before the war, effectively, Glasgow, the west of Scotland, because it had so much work there, industrial wise, through things like shipbuilding and coal mining, it seemed to have a secure future going forward. However, there were problems. In 1900, from 1900 onwards, industry started to struggle. Now, there were a number of reasons for this. Raw materials such as coal were running out. Now, coal is not an endless source. It does not last forever because it is a raw material. There is only so much coal available. Glasgow's key industries were growing, old, and facing competition from other countries across the world as well. Foreign workers would come across to work for less money, so foreign goods were cheaper potentially to buy elsewhere as well. So even though foreign workers would come to Scotland to work for cheaper in the countries they were coming from as well, there were people working there who were willing to work for less, and if you're paying your workers less, that means that you can make the goods for cheaper and sell them for less. There was also unrest amongst the industrial workers who'd wanted better pay and better conditions in Scotland at this time. And politically, the Scottish Labour Party, which was closely associated with the working class, was starting to attract a lot more support. And there was also a demand for better housing, healthcare and educational opportunities at this time. So there is struggles across Britain. Now, we're going to find out in more detail, in particular, about Scotland, because our unit is Scotland and era of the Great War. So although we do touch upon British involvement, it is all about Scottish involvement in the Great War. So, what I'd like you to do in your jotters, you might want to turn your jotter landscape to do this. So you've got a bit more room. You might want to do it over a double page even, so you've got more room as well. That would probably be a good idea. So, you have this mind map. So around your mind map you have the following. Health and housing. So we're going to find out what health and housing was like in Scotland at this time. Martial traditions. So why did Scots have a martial tradition? Population. So what do we know about Scottish population at this time? Migration to Scotland and people leaving Scotland. The Highlands of Scotland and what that was like. Scotland's economy, which we already touched upon, and a bit on industrial unrest, which we touched upon, and a bit more about politics. So this mind map here is going to help us to find out more about Scotland and life at this time. Now, your task. What you need to do is use the before 1914 cards, which are available as a Word document, which you'll see in the files folder, and create a mini fact file of life at this time in Scotland. So that's your 8 points around your mind map that you're looking to find out information about. You should have some information points for each of the headings. So I'd aim for maybe 2 points, even 3 points for each heading. Make sure you have at least 2. You're not looking to just copy out the cards word for word, you're just looking to summarise the information into a couple of points for each of those headings. So again, if you want to pause the PowerPoint here and complete this task, and then we're just going to go over some of the points in a bit more detail. So I'd pause it here and use the 1914 cards to create a mini fact file on life at this time. Okay, so population, what we can say about population, what you should have around your mind map, some of the points you could mention. Population was about 4.5 million, which is not that much different from today, and a lot of this population was mainly based in the 4 major cities of Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen. Scotland was becoming an urbanised society. Now, what's meant by that is a lot of people are moving from the countryside to come and live in cities. So in 1850, 1 Scot in 5 lived in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee or Aberdeen, and by 1900 it was 1 in every 3, so a lot of people are moving to the cities for work. Because of this created a massive overcrowding problem. The 1901 census showed that almost 70% of people in Glasgow lived in 1 or 2 roomed houses, and 90% of those people shared a toilet with another family. You could in some areas be sharing a toilet with up to 70 people or more. Visitors to Scotland marvelled at the country's growing wealth. They looked at the buildings, they came to see the nice things, but they were appalled by the living conditions in some of the cities that they visited as well. For migration. Now, what we mean by migration. Emigration is where people leave. So between 1904 and 1913, over 500,000 people left Scotland, mostly for the USA, Canada and Australia. About 1 in 3 eventually did return home, but a lot of Scottish people at this time did leave Scotland to go and find work and start a life elsewhere. Immigration is people coming into Scotland, so there was a lot of immigration at this time as well. Irish immigration was important up until 1914, especially in West Central Scotland. The Catholic population increased by about 100,000 between 1875 and 1900, and immigrants also came from other places like Italy and Lithuania in large numbers around 1900, all coming across to work in Scotland and trying to start a life here. So again, although there's people leaving Scotland, the immigrants that are coming in, this still adds to the growing pressure on housing at this time and does create a housing problem. The Highlands. In the 19th century, there had been big changes in the Highlands. Arguments still rage about the cause of these changes. Some believe that the changes was forced on the Highlanders by landowners trying to increase their income. So a lot of people in the Highlands were forced off their land to make way for sheep, which were more profitable. While others blame the growth of a tourist industry that wanted empty spaces with ruined houses, romantic castles and deer on the hills. So a lot of Highlanders were forced off their land and again had to move to the cities or abroad to start a new life and find work. Highlanders would move to either lowland cities, so places like Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee, or abroad to Canada, New Zealand and other parts of the Empire. For those who stayed in Scotland, life was very, very hard. Crofters became angry, and this erupted in the 1880s, where there were violent protests in Lewis and Skye. The Napier Commission reported that many Highlanders were living in misery and poverty. And the Crofters Act of 1886 stopped forced evictions and ended the right of landowners to charge whatever they wanted for rent. So Highlanders had a tough time at this time in Scotland. They were suffering a lot of problems. Scotland's economy, which you've also got around your mind map, around 1900, central Scotland was booming. As we know, it led the world in production of coal, iron, steel and shipbuilding and engineering. The coal industry in particular for Scotland was the fastest growing industry between 1880 and 1914, but by 1914 it was facing problems. The reason for that is it was failing to invest in a lot of new technology in the mines, so that created a lot of issues, and ultimately there was better ways to get things like electricity at this time as well. There was new ways, and Scotland wasn't as reliant just on coal. The iron and steel industry was also booming at this time in Scotland. By 1900, new technology had made possible the mass production of steel, and the naval race with Germany in the build-up to the war provided a huge boost to these industries. Shipbuilding. Now, as we know, by 1914, almost 20% of the world's shipping was built on the Clyde. The Royal Navy was important to its success here, so the building of the HMS Dreadnought in 1905 started a naval race with Germany. So ultimately what Germany and Britain were doing at this time was trying to outpace each other in the building of ships. So they're trying to make as many battleships as they could. Now, the more ships that are needed, obviously that means there's a big demand for ships, so that means there's a lot of demand for jobs. So people's jobs in Glasgow were very safe at this time because they were building these ships. However, by 1914, it was clear that the world was buying less from Scotland, and there was a concern as shipbuilding depended heavily on international trade, carrying Scottish exports around the world. So if there wasn't the demand for ships and it's starting to fall, then that means people are going to lose their jobs as well. Fishing at this time. Now, Britain and Scotland in particular saw a massive growth of railways in the years leading up to war. Now, the spread of the railways allowed fresh fish to be transported across Britain, with the result that many fishing ports such as Eyemouth began to prosper. But there were concerns about what would happen when the export markets in Eastern Europe vanished. So ultimately what happens, which we'll find out as well about later on in the course, is when war starts, that makes fishing very difficult, not only to actually go out to the sea and fish, but also where you're exporting the fish to. Some of the countries that Britain maybe was exporting fish to at this time during the war aren't able to buy that fish, so that causes issues as well. Textiles. The textile industry at this time was in decline by 1900. Reason being, again, textiles could be made for cheaper elsewhere and the demand was falling for Scottish textiles. However, it was still a major employer. Now in Dundee, I'm sure a lot of you will know, there was a lot of jute mills in Dundee, around 70, and they employed tens of thousands of people, especially women who worked in the jute mill. In the Highlands, although some industry was growing in the Highlands like whisky making, Harris Tweed and aluminium, there was no huge benefit to most of the Highland population. Distilleries employed very few people at this time, and although Scotland produced a third of the world's aluminium before World War One, it wasn't like there was loads of jobs in the Highlands. So again, that's why a lot of the Highlanders had to move to cities or abroad for work. Okay, so that was a wee bit on Scotland's economy and the key industries. Now, as we know, as we've discussed already, there was industrial unrest at this time. Strike action was the most common way to force employers to give the workers what they wanted. Now, trade unions wanted better pay and conditions and threatened strikes if they didn't get these things. At this time, you have to remember, conditions in people's place of work are very dangerous. People are dying at work quite regularly in Scotland because of a lack of health and safety. Now, these demands were made to help workers meet the rising cost of living as well. If they have better pay, then they can obviously try and meet the cost of living and try and get themselves out of poverty if possible. Now in 1912, wages in Scotland cities were 10% lower than in England, while the cost of things like food and rent were 5% higher. So if you're earning less and your cost of living is even higher, you're going to struggle and be in poverty. Most employers didn't give in to the demands, however, and industrial rest and high unemployment followed in Scotland. So number 5 in your mind map is politics. In terms of politics at this time, the main party that dominates Scotland is the Liberals. Now they dominate politics before 1914. The other parties, the Conservatives, Labour and Unionists, pose no real threat to them. In 1910 the Liberals won 57 out of 70 Scottish seats, so you see that they have quite a majority there. Now the reason that Liberals are so popular in Scotland, they claim to represent the best interests of working and middle class men. Now the reason it doesn't say women there is women are not allowed to vote at this time. They are not as involved in politics as what men are. In fact, women have very little say in politics, so it's about representing men the best that they can. Now they're against big landowners, so this is one of them votes in the Highlands. And the Liberals' social reforms help people who were poor through no fault of their own. So just before war, the Liberals had introduced a number of reforms to support people, and that ultimately gained them more popularity as well. The Conservative Party, why they were unpopular in Scotland this time, is they are associated with big landowners and landlords in the towns who were seen to be making huge profits from rents charged for poor quality housing. They supported a policy called protection, which was quite unpopular in Scotland. So protection meant putting up tariff barriers to protect British farming against foreign competition. Now the effect of this would be to make food from abroad more expensive, and that made them quite unpopular in Scotland, as it was felt that ultimately it was cutting off a lot of Scottish markets as well and forcing people to lose their jobs. And the last major party at this time is Labour. Now the Labour Party was very, very new and untested in 1914. And it failed to make any big impression before World War I, with only 3 Scottish MPs amongst the 42 British MPs in 1910. However, as we will find out, as war goes on, and just when war's about to come to an end, Labour Party is becoming more popular in Scotland. Now, health and housing in Scotland at this time, because of the big population by 1910, there's massive issues with overcrowding, so many Scottish houses were no longer fit for purpose and had become slums. In 1911, 13% of Scottish people lived in overcrowded conditions, and most homes were tenement flats that were dark and gloomy without any windows. Many families shared one toilet in the street, and the smell was very, very horrible, and disease spread rapidly and death rates were high. You'll be able to link this to when we looked at Victorian mysteries in S3 history and housing conditions then. This is what it was like. The government had not passed any laws about housing, so anything went on. Local governments were very weak, so councils didn't do very much at this time. They did not provide proper roads, sewers, drains, water supplies or cleaning service. Housing near workplaces were either old or as cheaply built as possible. And homes and workplaces used coal, so the smoke added to the horrible atmosphere around the houses. And the workplaces and factories polluted the nearby areas, so when you stepped out of your tenement flat in these overcrowded areas, it would be very, very dark, very, very misty. And when you're inhaling the air that's been polluted by things like the factories, the workplaces, that is not going to be good for your health either. Now, if you want to pause the PowerPoint at this point, you'll be able to click on both these film clips here and you'll be able to just watch 2 short film clips from BBC Bite Size. If you can't access them via the PowerPoint, then the links are in the notes as well. These are just letting you see a bit more at what housing conditions were like at this time. And I'll also just show you some pictures. I'll just flick through some pictures for you to let you see what conditions in Glasgow in particular were like at this time in terms of housing, and you can add any additional notes in as well. Now this picture is actually quite a famous picture at this time called King Cholera. Now cholera was a disease that a lot of people got by drinking dirty water, but if you look at this picture here, which again we have discussed in S3 history, you see what housing conditions were like at this time. You see how many people are there, how overcrowded it is, and some points you'll be able to see from that picture there. If you look at the bottom left hand corner, you have a woman picking food out of a midden pile, you've got a young boy playing the midden pile. You'll see the way that some of the children in particular are dressed. Their clothes, if they have any, are very old, very ragged. You'll see the way that the buildings are, not built very nicely. You'll see a coffin being carried in the crowd there, representing dead people at this time. So it was horrible conditions that a lot of people were living in. Okay, so that was housing conditions. Now, number 8 in your mind map is martial traditions. Now, martial relates to fighting or war, so Scottish people have a martial tradition, a fighting tradition. Now, before, during, and after World War I, Scottish soldiers were praised for their martial traditions. So they were seen to be brave, to be loyal, and to be trustworthy. Men who could be relied on to fight to the end for their friends, the regiment, and their country. So Scottish soldiers had a very, very good reputation of being very brave and loyal fighters. From the middle of the 18th century, the British government was keen to recruit Highlanders into the British Army, so the kilty soldier were seen as brave heroes. As the Empire grew, so the need for soldiers. So soldiers, Scottish soldiers, would be stationed across the Empire in different countries, defending it for Britain. Now, Highland landowners were only too happy to take advantage of government incentives to recruit men from their estates, so they were happy to get rid of people ultimately. When war broke out in 1914, the recruitment drive often made young Scottish men feel pressured into believing they should not let down their ancestors and Scotland's martial or military traditions. So, that was information around your mind map. Now, next task is just ultimately to summarise your mind map very briefly. So, use your fact file, your mind map, to create a wee summary table of what life was like in Scotland before 1914. Now, if you draw a table like the one below, and just pick 2 pieces of evidence that you think are the main points to describe that aspect. So, Scotland's people, what could we say about them before 1914? Scotland's industry, what's 2 key points you could say about that? Scotland's economy, so what issues is Scotland's economy facing? Try not to get industry and economy mixed up, although they are also closely related. Think about Scotland's main industries, so like coal, shipbuilding. Economy, think about issues with Scotland's economy, other problems that Scotland's facing, and any key points about Scotland's political parties. Okay, our last task is a describe question. Now, if you remember, the purpose of these questions is to describe what happened or the key features of a historical issue. Now, all information from this comes from your head. You don't have a source for this. You need to just put a short starter sentence with one of the question, and then just a few sentences of description depending on how many marks it's worth. Now, I'll say 3 marks would just be 3 sentences. A describe question in National 5 is worth 4 marks. You need to make 4 points. You just take a new sentence for each piece of evidence. Don't list, don't bullet point. Just take a new sentence for each piece of evidence. And as I've said, they'll never list or bullet point. So it's worth 4 marks. You get 1 mark for each simple point where you describe a key feature. You can get an additional mark for a developed point where you provide an extra piece of information or detail or example to support your simple point. Now, for example, if the question was describe the impact Scottish people had on their new homes overseas, a simple point would be one impact that the Scots had was that they became involved in politics, often achieved senior positions. So that would just be one simple point. If you were to develop that point, one impact that the Scots had was that they became involved in politics, often achieved senior positions. John A. Macdonald from Glasgow was the first ever Prime Minister of Glasgow. So that's a developed point there, so that would be worth 2 marks. Now, this is just an example from a different topic, which is Migration Empire, which we aren't doing at National 5. But this is just an example to let you see how you would answer this question. Now, the question that we are going to answer is describe Scottish society before 1914. Now, your starter sentence, all you need to say is there are many ways to describe Scottish society before 1914. And then you've got there to help you, firstly, secondly, thirdly, fourthly. So you're just looking to make 4 points about Scottish society before 1914. So use all the information that you've gathered from this PowerPoint to answer this question and then upload your answer via the assignment tab. If you have any questions, you can let us know. Okay, thank you.